non me la sento di fare il giro, ma sarebbe per me un piacere se il giro lo faceste voi. E vi saluto qui.
As the sun went down over the majestic walls of the Vatican, the crowd in St. Peter's Square fell silent. Thousands of people from all over the world turned their heads upward, their eyes fixed on Pope Francis, the 266th leader of the Catholic Church, whose humility and compassion had changed the shape of the papacy. As he prepared to speak, the air was heavy with emotion, and his voice shook with the power of his words. The gravity of the situation meant that Pope Francis's farewell would not only mark the end of a chapter, but also the end of a transformative era that had changed the Church and touched millions of lives. It was an emotional farewell, and when he started to speak, his voice shook with emotion. "Dear brothers and sisters," he said, "thank you for walking this journey with me." His voice cracked, and for a moment he paused, too overwhelmed by the weight of the moment. The crowd held on. Every word they spoke with the knowledge that this wasn't just a goodbye, it was the end of an era that would change the world. Pope Francis was born Jorge Mario Bergoglio in Buenos Aires, Argentina. He came from nothing to become a global figure of compassion and reform as the first Jesuit pope and the first from the Americas. He chose the name Francis in honor of Saint Francis of Assisi, which shows how deeply he has dedicated himself to service through simplicity over the years. He was a strong supporter of the weak and a vocal opponent of unfair treatment of people, climate change, and corruption. When he spoke to the crowd, his words carried the weight of his papacy. "I have tried to serve with love, to walk with you, to listen to your struggles, and to remind you of God's infinite mercy." He talked about the challenges the Church faced because of the fights against injustice and the hope that remained for a better future. His simple but powerful words showed how he felt, and when he was done speaking, there was a deep, profound silence in the square. Then, like a wave, the crowd erupted into applause, their cheers mixing with tears that ran freely down their faces. Pope Francis was also moved to tears, and he raised his hands in a final blessing, whispering, "May God bless you always." As he turned to leave, he stopped briefly, his eyes lingering on the crowd one last time. His eyes were a mix of sadness and peace, showing that he had given his all to his job. As the crowd watched him walk away into the shadows of the Vatican, they knew that this farewell would stay in their hearts forever as a moment of love, humanity, and hope. The legacy of Pope Francis is to reform compassion and justice. As the years go by, his legacy grows stronger, rooted in his unwavering commitment to do so from the moment he stepped onto the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica in 2013. Everyone knew this papacy would be different. Pope Francis, born Jorge Mario Bergoglio in Buenos Aires, Argentina, quickly won over millions of people with his humility and kindness. He chose the name Francis because he wanted to lead a church that put an emphasis on simplicity, service, and caring for the poor from the start. Pope Francis made it clear that his mission was to bring the Catholic Church closer to the people. He rejected many of the traditional. Instead of living in luxury as Pope, he chose to live simply and focus on the things that really mattered. His plan was to boldly reform the Vatican, restore trust in the Church, and deal with global problems like inequality, climate change, and the refugee crisis. He became a voice for the voiceless, speaking out for the poor, the marginalized, and those who had been forgotten by society. One of the most important things about his papacy was that he worked to reform the Church. Pope Francis also worked to make the Vatican's finances public. He didn't shy away from talking about tough issues like sexual abuse in the Church, defrocking high-ranking clergy, and hosting a global summit to address the crisis were just a few of the things he did to show his commitment to justice and healing outside the walls of the Vatican. Pope Francis became a figure of hope around the world. He spoke out against economic inequality and asked world leaders to put the poor first, and his groundbreaking work, Encyclical Laudato Si', linked environmental degradation with poverty. People should care about the planet and each other, and Pope Francis's kind treatment of LGBTQ people, which he summed up in the famous words, "Who am I to judge?" set a new tone for the Church. Throughout it all, Pope Francis remained a man of the people, whether he washed the feet of prisoners, comforted refugees, or hugged children on his travels. His legacy is one of action and inspiration, a reminder that faith can grow when combined with compassion. Pope Francis's legacy will live on, leading the Church and inspiring future generations. From Buenos Aires to the Vatican, the journey of Pope Francis. As the sun rose over the busy streets of Buenos Aires, a young Jorge Mario Bergoglio walked through the city he called home, unaware of the amazing journey that lay ahead. Born on December 17, 1936, to immigrant parents in a modest neighborhood, Jorge grew up surrounded by the rich culture of Argentina. His father worked as a. As a child, Jorge's mother took care of the family while his father worked on the railroad. From a young age, Jorge showed humility, compassion, and a connection to the struggles of regular people. His path to the church wasn't straightforward. He wanted to be a chemist and worked briefly in a food lab before feeling a deeper calling. At age 21, he started the seminary, where he studied philosophy and theology on his way from the streets of Buenos Aires to the highest office in the Catholic Church, Miguel, and was ordained a priest in 1969. During his early years as a priest and later as Archbishop of Buenos Aires, Jorge was dedicated to helping the poor and the outcast. He often took public buses to visit slums and put the needs of the weak ahead of church bureaucracy. In 2001, Pope John Paul II made Jorge cardinal. As a cardinal, he was known for his simplicity, living in a small apartment, cooking his own meals, and refusing the luxuries that are usually associated with church leaders, even though he was becoming more powerful. He was a shepherd who walked among his sheep, and his humility earned him a lot of respect. On March 13, 2013, Jorge Mario Bergoglio was elected pope. He was the first Jesuit, the first pope from the Americas, and the first pope to take the name Francis. He chose this name because he admired Saint Francis of Assisi, who was known for his simplicity, humility, and care for creation. From that point on, Pope Francis's journey became one of global significance. From the streets of Buenos Aires to the halls of the Vatican, Pope Francis's journey shows how dedicated he is to humility, reform, and compassion. His story reminds us that even the most extraordinary leaders come from humble beginnings, and Pope Francis has stayed true to the values that made him who he is: love, service, and a close connection to the people he serves. Pope Francis and the fight against corruption in the church in the shadowy corridors of the Vatican. For decades, rumors of corruption had been going around the Vatican. The Catholic Church, which was once revered for its spiritual guidance, had become known for its wealth and secrecy. For years, stories of financial mismanagement and scandals hurt the Church's reputation, shaking the faith of millions of people around the world. When Pope Francis was elected in 2013, he took over an institution that was already struggling with these problems, but he was not like other popes. From the start, Pope Francis made it clear that he would not stand for corruption. He was ready to do something about it. Born in Buenos Aires and shaped by the struggles of the working class, Pope Francis brought a unique perspective to the papacy. His humble beginnings and Jesuit upbringing gave him a strong sense of justice and responsibility. As leader of the Catholic Church, he vowed to change the institution from the inside, which would be hard and dangerous. One of his first tasks was to deal with the Vatican's finances, which had been kept secret for a long time because the Vatican Bank had been accused of money laundering. Pope Francis set up a new council to oversee the Church's finances, bringing in independent auditors and experts to make sure everything was clear. He also created the Secretariat for the Economy to keep an eye on financial operations, which upset the Church's old guard, who were used to an unaccountable system. But Pope Francis's fight wasn't just about numbers, it was about the soul of the Church. He spoke out against greed and the unchecked pursuit of wealth. His vision was clear: the Church should serve the poor, not enrich itself at their expense. His reforms, however, were not universally welcomed within the Vatican. Powerful people pushed back, afraid of losing their influence and privilege. Threats to his authority and even his life became a daily reality for him. Despite the opposition, Pope Francis remained steadfast. He once said, "Reform is not easy, but it is necessary," and his determination to root out corruption was based on his. He had unwavering faith and believed that the Church should be a beacon of morality, not a sign of excess. As soon as he became Pope Francis, he made it clear that his mission was to be a voice for those who had none. Born Jorge Bergoglio in Buenos Aires, Argentina, he grew up in a working-class family and saw the struggles and strength of everyday people. This gave him a deep understanding of the poor, the outcast, and those who had been pushed to the edges. As Pope, Francis brought that compassion with him and directed the Catholic Church's attention to the people who needed it the most. One of the most important things about his papacy was his fight for social justice. He spoke out against the unfairness of economic inequality and asked governments and individuals to do more for the poor. He once said that the global system is one in which few people have a lot of money while millions of people go without basic needs. His words struck a chord with many people. But Pope Francis's work for refugees and migrants doesn't end there. He has been a tireless champion for them, urging the world to welcome them with open arms instead of fear and prejudice. In 2016, he visited the Greek island of Lesbos and met refugees who had fled war and persecution. He hugged them, listened to their stories, and brought 12 refugee families back to the Vatican with him as a sign of his support. These actions spoke louder than any words ever could. Could the environment have been a central part of his fight for justice? In 2015, Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si called attention to the links between environmental damage and social inequality. He told the world to take care of our shared home and understand that climate change hurts the poor the most. His message was clear: protecting the planet is not just an environmental issue, it is a moral one. Throughout his papacy, Pope Francis has never been afraid to face uncomfortable truths, whether it was about the Church's past. He has always stood with the weak, whether he was speaking out against racism or calling for more acceptance. His legacy is one of kindness and action, a reminder that real faith is more than just words. It means standing up for those who can't do it themselves. Faith and reform. Pope Francis's vision for a new Catholic Church. From the moment he stepped onto the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica in 2013, it was clear that his papacy would be marked by change. In his humble white robes, classic, he didn't greet the world as a holy figure, but as a servant of the people. Born Jorge Mario Bergoglio in Buenos Aires, Argentina, Pope Francis brought with him a vision of a Catholic Church that wasn't cold or rigid, but open, caring, and deeply connected to the lives of its followers. His mission was clear: to renew the Church through faith and reform. Pope Francis's vision for the Church has always been based on humility and service. He turned down the fancy papal apartment and chose to live in a simple apartment instead. These small but meaningful actions showed that he wanted a simpler, more accessible church that put people before power. But his changes went far beyond mere symbolism. From the start, Pope Francis set out to deal with the deeper problems the Church was facing, such as financial corruption and the crisis of clergy sexual abuse. One of his first big goals was to make the Vatican's finances public. For decades, the Church had been criticized for poor management and secrecy, but Pope Francis worked to change that. He set up councils and hired independent auditors to keep an eye on the Church's money, to make sure it was used to help the poor and vulnerable, not to enrich the powerful. But for Pope Francis, reforming the Church wasn't just about getting rid of corruption, it was also about rekindling its spiritual mission. He stressed mercy, compassion, and acceptance, telling the Church to be a field hospital for people who had been hurt by life. His famous words, "Who am I to judge?" showed a move toward a more open end. Many people, including divorced Catholics and LGBTQ people, felt left out for a long time. Pope Francis also wanted the Church to take on the world's biggest problems. He spoke out against economic inequality, environmental destruction, and the plight of refugees, reminding Catholics of their duty to care for each other and the planet. Through his actions and words, he changed what it meant to lead with faith. As the sun went down, the emotional farewells of Pope Francis. As the sun set over the Vatican, St. Peter's Square was filled with a quiet crowd of people from all over the world standing shoulder to shoulder, their faces a mix of sadness and joy. They had come to see something amazing: Pope Francis saying goodbye to one of his many emotional goodbyes over the years. These moments, which were raw and full of humanity, had become a hallmark of his papacy. One of the most memorable of these was when the Pope himself cried. During his trip to Mexico, Pope Francis spoke to the crowd while standing on the tarmac. His voice was shaking with emotion as he said, "Dear brothers and sisters of Mexico." His eyes shining with tears as he said, "I am about to leave this beloved land. My heart is full of sadness, but also with gratitude." The crowd was silent and hung on his every word as he talked about the kindness and strength of the Mexican people, the children whose laughter had touched his soul, and the struggles they faced with unwavering faith. Pope Francis whispered his last goodbye to Coos Hermanos before getting on the plane, leaving a piece of his heart behind. This wasn't an isolated moment. Pope Francis's goodbyes had a way of touching people from all walks of life during his historic visit to the United States. He stood on the South Lawn of the White House and spoke to a nation built on justice and freedom, his voice full of nostalgia and hope. People in the crowd were mesmerized and showed a range of emotions. Some were smiling through tears, while others were silently absorbing his words. When he was done, the applause was deafening, showing what a strong connection he had made with them. Pope Francis on global issues like climate change, refugees, and inequality. From the start of his papacy, Pope Francis made it clear that his mission went far beyond the walls of the Vatican. He saw the wrongs in the world and the suffering of. He saw the need for the Church to take action with a compassionate heart and a call for change. Pope Francis became a global voice for the weak, speaking out against some of the world's biggest problems, including climate change, the refugee crisis, and economic inequality. Pope Francis's stance on climate change was groundbreaking. In 2015, he released his encyclical Laudato Si', which was a passionate plea to care for our common home. In it, he linked environmental destruction to the Pope Francis called on world leaders to act before it was too late, saying that the earth was a gift from God and that people had a moral duty to protect it. Our home is beginning to look more and more like an enormous pile of filth, he warned, calling for urgent reforms. His words had an impact beyond the church, starting conversations among scientists, policymakers, and activists. At the same time, he brought attention to the plight of refugees, asking nations to welcome those fleeing war and persecution. In 2016, while on a visit to the Greek island of Lesbos, he met with refugees face-to-face, hugging them and listening to their stories of heartbreak and survival. In a powerful act of solidarity, he brought 12 refugee families back to the Vatican, where he gave them shelter and hope. His actions spoke louder than words, calling on world leaders to show compassion instead of building walls. Pope Francis also spoke out against economic inequality. Honesty, he spoke out against worshiping money and systems that let the rich do well while the poor were left behind. He called for a more fair distribution of wealth and reminded everyone that human dignity should never be sacrificed in the name of making money. Pope Francis won the hearts of millions of people around the world with a warm smile and a humble attitude. He became known as the People's Pope very quickly because he didn't sit on a high throne but instead tried to be close to the people he served. Born Jorge Mario Bergoglio in Buenos Aires, Argentina, he had a deep understanding of the problems that regular people faced, and this understanding became the basis of his papacy. One of the most impressive things about Pope Francis's leadership has been his ability to connect with people from all walks of life, whether he was visiting the sick in. By doing things like washing prisoners' feet or welcoming refugees, he showed that real leadership is about service, not authority. When he went to different countries, he made time to meet regular people, listen to their stories, and share in their joys and sorrows. This genuine interest made him not just a figure of authority, but a beloved friend. Pope Francis's messages of compassion and acceptance struck a chord with many people, especially those who felt left out or forgotten. The plight of the poor, the homeless, and the outcast, reminding everyone that everyone deserves respect and dignity. His famous statement, "Who am I to judge about LGBTQ people?" marked a major shift in tone for the church, welcoming many back who had felt left out. His travels were also impressive, from the busy streets of Manila to the refugee camps in Lesbos. During his 2015 visit to the United States, Pope Francis brought a message of hope. He captivated audiences with his warmth and acceptance. People waited in line to catch a glimpse of him, their faces beaming with happiness. He spoke of love, mercy, and how important it is to care for each other, bringing people together across borders. With his down-to-earth style and heartfelt messages, Pope Francis has reminded us all of the importance of compassion, humility, and service. He has shown that the role of the Pope is not just to lead, but also to love. His unique ability to touch hearts and inspire change has left an indelible mark on the Church and the world. Pope Francis's lasting effect on the Catholic Church since being elected in 2013, Pope Francis has brought a wave of hope to the Catholic Church, changing its image and mission in the modern world. With a gentle demeanor and a heart full of compassion, he has inspired millions, reminding them that faith is about love, mercy, and service. His papacy has been a transformative journey that seeks to reconnect the Church with the people. From the start, Pope Francis stressed the importance of being humble and simple. He chose to live in a guest house instead of the fancy papal apartments, which showed that he wanted to be a more grounded and approachable leader. His lifestyle choices showed that he believed the Church should focus on the needs of the poor and the marginalized by putting service over power. He set a new tone for the Vatican that deeply resonated with believers who wanted a more caring Church. A big part of Pope Francis's papacy has been his focus on social justice. He has always talked about global problems like poverty, climate change, and inequality, and he has urged the faithful to do something about them. In his encyclical Laudato Si', he called for a collective effort to care for our planet, connecting environmental responsibility to social justice. This message has inspired many people and groups to do meaningful work to protect the Earth and its most vulnerable inhabitants. Pope Francis has also worked to make the world a more. His approach to LGBTQ issues and divorced Catholics has been marked by compassion and understanding. By asking, "Who am I to judge?" he opened the door for dialogue and acceptance, inviting everyone to feel welcome within the church's embrace. This change has given hope to many who felt left out by previous church teachings. Also, his kind actions, like washing prisoners' feet, visiting refugee camps, and visiting sick people, have shown that the church is called to be a field hospital for those in need. Faith is more than just a set of beliefs, it's a lived experience of love and service. As Pope Francis continues his ministry, his impact on the Catholic Church is still felt deeply. He has brought back hope and joy, inspiring the faithful to embrace a more passionate and active faith. His legacy is one of renewal, reminding us that the Church can be a powerful force for good in a world that desperately needs it. Francis has shown that hope is not just a feeling, it's a call to action.